Okay, so today let's talk about the Reconstruction era. This is the era that takes place immediately after the Civil War. A lot subscribe to the notion that the 13th Amendment signing and ratification of it, abolishing slavery as the start of this. There's also the military occupation of the former Confederate States of America going on. There's a lot of things going on with the country as far as, like how do we compromise and rebuild things, hence the term Reconstruction. How do we reconstruct the Union into a working system that is fair and equitable, but also is progressive and liberal in the sense that we have ended slavery. You cannot have half the country dependent on that particular institution any longer. So we're looking at the years here, roughly 1865 summer through 1877, concluding with the Reconstruction compromise that will happen here in 1877 that sets up the election results of 76 and puts in place the new president. All right, so Lincoln, before he is assassinated, he has this idea that is pretty straightforward and simple. He is of the mind that if you can get just, like 10% of the population in each of the former rebellion states, the Confederate states, to swear loyalty to the United States, that particular state should be readmitted in and allowed to basically go on and take full rights and privileges of being a state, expected to write a new state constitution, obviously still, but readmitted into the Union with all the privileges and benefits and security prospects, therefore, of each state. So Lincoln has a pretty calm, I guess you would call it his best word for it, approach to how we're going to bring in these former rebellious states and back into the Union. The problem with that is a lot of other people look at this and like, well, then how does that honor the hundreds of thousands who died fighting to end slavery? And like, why do we even have to have this war? And you look back just sheerly at the numbers. One of the great what ifs in American history is right here. We could have actually paid less money to just buy the slaves their freedom as like a fair market value, as dehumanizing as that sounds. We would spend less money buying them out than we did actually carrying forth the war effort and the debt that the Union and the Confederates both brought on themselves by engaging in this particular Civil War. So it's a great what if history moment where, like, if we had just gone on and bought out slavery and bought out the institution of slavery, and the federal government had done some kind of subsidy to create an incremental end to slavery, would it have been better? Would it have accomplished the same thing, though, at the same time? It's a great what-if question because you probably should be able to see it. On the one hand, no slave owner wants to just willingly give up their slaves. But if it were an incremental thing, would at least some, I mean, it's highly likely that all would be on board, but would at least some be on board with the notion that okay, we're going to transition this particular population, our slaves, into more of an actual farming standpoint as a sharecropper or a tenant farmer or even a migrant farmer. There'd probably be some who would buy into that, seeing the writing on the wall. On the flip side of that, would the same effect, ethically and morally, have been realized? What I mean is, fighting a war is a pretty concrete, tangible statement of this particular way of life and this particular worldview won out. Slavery needs to be abolished and ended as an institution. It cannot be brought back. That I would argue it needed to have a war to actually go on and get people to see the seriousness and the severity of how much that was dividing the country. Now, Lincoln's plan being so calm and not very abrasive to anybody out there, except for the northern, more radical faction, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, his plan really goes by the wayside. Once he is assassinated, his plan largely just goes out the window. Congress sees a chance to do something. And largely, him being assassinated basically takes away his voice, right, in politics. Now, for his administration, elected in 1864, he had chosen Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. And as you probably know, with the line of succession in the U.S. politics, the vice president will take over upon the death of the president or the resignation of the president. So Johnson very figuratively is taking a look at this, and he's saying, well, you know what? Let the men, meaning the southern states, if they pledge allegiance, repeal secession, abolish slavery, and cancel their war debts. But Sumner and some of the more radical Republican faction in Congress are like, no, like they gotta pay for this. They need to like pay some kind of reparation. They need to be punished. They should not be able to just come back in as if the war never happened. Hundreds of thousands of people died fighting to end slavery as an institution and fighting for the right for the Union, the United States, to continue on with its system. So the radical Republicans largely adopt this platform of the South is going to pay these reparations. They're going to be punished. They're going to have a limited power and incrementally gain it back. They will, of course, have to abolish slavery because that was one of the goals of the war, especially after 1863, and give African Americans a right to vote. So just a little more specific, because a lot of the radical Republicans, I think they saw the writing on the wall also, in that if all we do is abolish slavery, what's to keep segregation, or something even worse than segregation, taking foothold in the South? Like, foreshadowing here. Well, when we talk about these two factions kind of like butting heads and whatnot in Congress, the actual radical Republicans, they have the numbers, and the legislature is going to pass the laws. They're going to control it, and eventually they're going to even impeach Andrew Johnson during this time period also. So he'll be the first president actually impeached while in office. So let's get radical with the radical Republicans. Their plan is going to be to readmit to the Union the states of the South Shore, but with much stricter expectations and guidelines. So, first up, the military is already down there. Okay, so let's make sure that the Confederate Army has disbanded, has gone its ways, and actually like gone back home to their homesteads, and are not taking up arms. One of the greatest fears, and we talked about it also in the Civil War lecture series, one of the greatest what-ifs also is, had General Lee at the end of the Civil War in 1965 not surrendered and sent letters to his colonels and his other generals saying, please do not pursue a war of attrition in the Civil War. We've lost. Let's suck it up and let's move on with it. Had he not done that, had he actually allowed the leaders in the field to go with what they had planned for an elongated war, things could have gotten very dirty. Come to mind the war of attrition in Vietnam, the ongoing war of attrition in the Middle East since the 21st century began as well. These are conflicts that, sure, there is plenty of justification for them. I wouldn't argue that. But there's also a lot of money involved, a lot of manpower involved, a lot of risk involved in what we do in our foreign affairs. And this is right in our backyard. So I would argue a much more serious and severe issue. So we're going to break up the Confederacy into military districts for the time being, in perpetuity, until things are rebuilt and we're sure that, not just slavery is abolished, but that there are protections in place for citizenship and voting. Again, foreshadowing needed amendments in 14 and 15 coming up very quickly after this. We're going to make sure the military is in place and keeping control. So here are the districts they're going to set up all the way over to Texas and military district number 5. Now, the 13th Amendment is going to be signed in 1865. This was the dream baby of Abraham Lincoln. He most certainly made the Civil War targeted towards ending slavery after the Battle of Antietam and the beginning of 1863 when he reads for the first time his Emancipation Proclamation. And he gains a lot of legacy and popularity for being the so-called Great Emancipator. If you remember, however, the Emancipation Proclamation, to avoid having the border states kind of leave the Union and create a whole other mess that Lincoln didn't want to deal with at the time, he worded the emancipation in a way that it only freed the slaves in those states that are rebelling, meaning the South, the Confederacy. And it gave a path to citizenship for the African Americans who had either fled or through legal means or illegal means, whatever. They're in the North now, but we still at the time had to respect the law, the fugitive slave law, and ask, do you have proof that you're a citizen, proof that you're free? And oftentimes, no, they can't always, confirm that. So we had this compelling law to go on and turn them into the authorities. And now with the Emancipation Proclamation, there's a path to citizenship for those in the North. So it changes everything. Number 13, abolishes slavery outrightly. Now, you should logically think with the 13th Amendment. I'll go back to it just so we're not confused on it. You should be thinking in your head, if all these things were in question and the abolition movement had pushed for voting rights, for land rights, for all the promises made in the Declaration and all the protections enumerated in the Bill of Rights, that the freed slaves at this point should be given all those rights and privileges like an average American citizen. You are probably correct in that. However, because it's not worded expressly like that, there were circumstances in the South that would take advantage of the newly freed slaves and would create the black codes and the Jim Crow laws as well. Now, the black codes are the more dangerous of the two, I would say, but they're both equally ridiculous. What I mean by this, Jim Crow laws are all about segregation. So when we're talking, like the Jim Crow laws of the deep, deep South, like Louisiana, parts of Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, so on and so forth, these areas, they have these Jim Crow laws that would eventually lead to the public places being legally segregated. Within the next 30 years, there would actually be a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that outrightly says, sure, go on and segregate everything as long as it's separate but still equal. But who's going to actually police if it's equal? And like who can actually report that it's not equal and would actually be taken if things are pretty obviously not equal? So it creates some very interesting gray area and question on well, if it's obviously not equal, then how is this legal? And there's some pretty serious issues there. So Jim Crow laws are all about the segregation, the division of the colors of our skin. When we talk about black codes, these were by and large former slave codes where the word slave had been X'd through and just replaced with Negro. And now these black codes would actually create this code of discipline, if you will, for public and in many cases even private circumstances. How was a black person supposed to talk to a white person when they're walking on the street? Do they nod? Do they make eye contact? Do they salute? Each state would have different black codes, and sometimes even areas would have different black codes. And a lot of the time we see all the way even into the 1950s with Emmett Till, a lot who came from the North, where it was a little more progressive, but still plenty of race riots going on throughout the 20th century. We see a complete unawareness and even ignorance of how serious the black codes were. So we'll get into that as we move into more of the 20th century civil rights movements. Now, the 14th Amendment was intended in its writing to create equal protection under the law for the newly freed blacks. What it ends up doing in its wording and actual implementation is it gives freedom of rights and choices and protections and equal status under the law really to the poor white farmers who weren't completely enfranchised at this time either. Now, again, it's obviously intended for the newly freed black population. That it helps out some of the poor whites out there in the outer reaches of the country, that's fine and dandy also. But it's supposed to extend these citizenship rights, and it even sets up one of our more famous and strongest held beliefs for citizenship, this idea that if you're born on American soil, you're a naturalized citizen right then and there. So that creates some legal issues, and I wouldn't even say they're legal issues, it's right there in the Constitution. It's the 14th Amendment saying if you're born on American soil, you're American. So it creates a battle between people with different immigration viewpoints very quickly, and I guess even into today. So realizing that the Southern black codes and Jim Crow laws and the rise of the first KKK are happening, Congress takes it upon itself to go on and pass a Third Amendment, which is just unprecedented. 3 amendments in the course of just 4.5 years, basically. It's kind of like the pace of writing the Bill of Rights. It hadn't happened. So in this case, the 15th Amendment takes a look at what should have been kind of interpreted from the 13th Amendment and the 14th. If they're going to be free and they're going to have equal protection under the law and be a citizen, then they should probably be able to vote, right? I would say yes. But because there were ways of getting around that, Congress went on and passed this 15th Amendment, extending the right to vote to African American males. It's not as if African American females are going to get to vote before white females. They get that coming to fruition by 1919. But the wording of the 15th Amendment is what makes this a very big disaster and controversial issue. The wording of it, I'll paraphrase, of course, here. The wording of the 15th Amendment is something to the effect of, like, you can't actually block a person from voting simply because of, like, what their status was. Like, were they a slave? Were they free? On if they can read, if they can understand questions, if they can afford to pay a poll tax. You can't basically, like, go on and say you can't vote just because you're black. However, it leaves open this large variables on ways you could block a person, because again, the way it's worded is, and understand this, it's worded in a way that simply says you can't block a person simply because of the color of their skin. But the South largely interprets that as, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to let this guy vote, not because you're black, but because you can't pay this tax, or because you don't own land here, or because your grandfather was a slave. The whole grandfather clause becomes a really controversial issue, because it's like, where does that even come from? Like, why is it that, like, a third generation down in the family, like, all of a sudden that's okay for someone to vote? That don't really make a lot of sense, right? So there's a lot of loopholes, I would call them, that are allowed when we talk about black rights and voting because of the way the 15th Amendment is worded. Now, was that intentional? I would say yes. I'm sorry, but these folks in Congress know what they're writing. They're largely lawyers, and if not, they know legal jargon, and they know the people who write the jargon for them to actually sign the bill and pass it as a law. So it was intended this way. So again, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. 13th accomplishes a great thing. Ends the institution of slavery. Number 14, did it actually achieve its intention of extending citizenship rights and protection under the law? Kind of, sort of. 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right for black males to vote. I would say that largely failed. So maybe well-intentioned, executed, what a sham. So Reconstruction comes to a head in the election of 1876, where we have Hayes and Wheeler pretty much come to a near standstill, like who's going to win it. And under those close of elections, it goes to the House. The House is supposed to vote on it. If it goes up above that, the Senate looks at it. If it goes above that, the Supreme Court looks at it. You probably have a general idea of how elections can be recounted to death. And in this case, a compromise is reached. The compromise 1877. It's going to go on and say, okay, Rutherford Hayes, a governor at the time, is going to be allowed to become the president, and we're going to end the era of Reconstruction, meaning the military districts will be gone, meaning the freedmen's bureaus that had developed in the South, they'll largely be incrementally phased out as well. So you look at it, 12 years, that's it, after the end of the Civil War, the South is under very close watch by the military districts, by military commanders who have very clear mandates that they follow. Part of that is also like the 40 acres and the mule that kind of gets past the wayside because of this here compromise. It goes out the door. It leaves the freed slave in a place of complete uncontrol. There were a few who had the resources or the connections to get out of the South. Many did not, and a large part of them did not have enough of an education to even be successful in cities that they could potentially move into. And some, they liked farming. Especially when you're farming for yourselves, it's a sense of pride when you own your own land. But a lot of them would not be able to afford land, so they ended up what we call sharecropping, and that creates a whole other issue set that we'll look at in the 20th century. All right, so let's sum this all up. So Reconstruction ends 1877. The Union, the United States, as Lincoln's original aim, preserve the Union. Did that succeed? Sure. Secondary aim, end slavery. Did that succeed? Sure. Yes, it did. Third, a tertiary aim from Lincoln when he was still president, get citizenship rights to the freed blacks. Did that succeed? Not so much. Now, I can't argue that it's like that everywhere. There's obviously pockets of the country where most certainly that was true. But there's a lot more where it was not true. All right. So again, the rising of the first KKK happens at this time. It becomes the military arm of the Democrat Party. A lot of the Southern leadership for legislators, meaning the U.S. Senate and the representatives who would come out of the South once Reconstruction ends, they're largely the same people who were there before. And I don't think it's like all of a sudden the racism and ideas of limited capabilities of blacks just disappeared. And, as affected by the Civil War as they may have been, they held their beliefs pretty strong and close to their hearts. So the first KKK comes to power, and it is meant to intimidate especially the Southern black voter into staying at home, not voting. They can't bring back slavery, but they can try to at least enforce these black codes and these Jim Crow laws to a degree to where blacks were afraid to largely do anything that might be seen as rebellious. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't great strides in racial equality. There was, for the first time, black congressmen and senators popping up at state legislatures and even the federal legislature. And for the first time, we see in the South where the populations are actually majority black in many of the states' borders, they're actually getting black people into positions of power in the government. And then it reverts. So, the 1877 Compromise. Was it good? Probably not. And overall, the legacy of Reconstruction, it's up to you to read and decide, and your assignments and discussions, obviously. Take my view of it for one thing, but come up with your own ideas as well with it. Did Reconstruction work? If we say that the aim of Reconstruction was to rebuild the United States and have a tangible course of action for being a one body, just like, say, the Civil War transforms these United States into this United States. We're a single country now, a single body, a single name as well. Did that succeed? Sure. Yeah, of course. The idea of slavery ending, yeah, that kind of worked. But we replaced slavery with sharecropping, with Jim Crow, with these black codes. And it creates problems that still exist today in the 21st century, as you probably know, and will for some time, I feel. So, was Reconstruction a success? I give it a large fail. I think if the aim was simply to rebuild the Union, sure, you could say that worked. But if Reconstruction was also to mold, or in this case, remold the Union into an accepting state of this is the new status quo, that did not reach its conclusion. Maybe another 4 years that could have changed, because freedmen bureaus were doing a lot of good. Vocational education, doing a lot of good. Access to farmland, doing a lot of good. But we didn't see it through. Instead, we have a political election that is so close that we end up having to pass a compromise to settle it. And that compromise does a lot of damage, especially to the south part of the United States. All right, guys, that's what I have for you on Reconstruction. I hope that helps you in your studies.